Modern day Duke Street in the east end of Glasgow is known for many things, like its cool new bars and cafes, new developments happening right now, for being part of the highly in-demand Dennistoun area, and from being the longest street in Britain going from the city centre to the Forge shopping centre in Shettleston. People don't tend to think of it as the home of Glasgow's worst murderers and violent criminals, for it was once the home of Duke Street Prison. This is the story of this bygone institution, just yards from present-day Strathclyde University, where nothing but a bit of border wall is left. A hulking, dark, oppressive complex of Glasgow's old world. Here we go again, another video. Please like, please comment, please subscribe. Duke Street Prison was built in 1798 and was also known as the Glasgow Bridewell. It was situated in the present-day Ladywell housing estate. The housing estate sits between Duke Street, John Knox Street, where the Drygate Bar is, High Street and Cathedral Square. Think about it as south of the cathedral, if you know Glasgow. Only remnants of the border wall remain today. It has been cut down into an ordinary-sized wall around Ladywell. Onlookers would never ever suspect its origin. Over the years, the prison changed shape and grew from its original layout. By the end, it was a complex of sandstone prison wings with barred windows. Some of the blocks were up to 5 floors high. The grounds included outdoor exercise areas, and pictures show linens drying in the yard. Conditions inside varied over the years, but more on that later. Let's take a look at the background. What was the backdrop to criminal justice, the prison system in Scotland in the 1700s? Prior to the late 1700s, the concept of prison for punishment was unknown. Jails served a custodial purpose to detain criminals pending payment of debt, execution, or transportation. The requirement for prison was simply to secure a space for a number of prisoners. Individual cells were very rare. The governance was determined on a local and ad hoc basis. No national regulation would come in until later in the 1800s. Prior to prison reform, prison accommodation was found in borough toll booths. It was one of the many civil functions served by these town buildings. But there was a need for change to host the growing number of criminals in and around Glasgow. So up sprang larger facilities like Duke Street Prison, or, as it was also known, the Glasgow Bridewell or the North Prison. Bridewell is an older term for a prison, especially for housing petty criminals. The maps of Glasgow, the old maps, they all vary in the labelling of the location from all 3 terms: North Prison, Glasgow Bridewell, Bridewell, Duke Street Prison. But today, it can be commonly known as Duke Street Prison. When Duke Street Prison opened, it soon became a nightmarish place to be. Like most Imperial or Victorian era prisons, it was cold and damp and overcrowded and unsanitary. The prison received terrible reports in the Glasgow Herald. One report in 1799, a year after it opened, said, open quotes, "From want of sufficient accommodation to meet the swelling population, it has not infrequently happened that as many as 6, 8 and 10 individuals were chained together in the same cell, 8 foot by 7 foot, ill ventilated and horribly arranged. The old and the young were mixed together, the hardened and the most pliable." Close quotes. Not a nice image. 8 foot by 7 foot. That's maybe the size of a typical garden shed. Imagine keeping 8 people in that. Can you imagine the look and the smell and the feel of such a place? But it was not to remain so. Some 26 years later, a select committee of the House of Commons found out conditions had drastically changed at the Bridewell, and for the best. It is thanks to a man called William Brebner, who is an unsung pioneer of prison reform in Scotland. The Scot, born in Huntly in 1783, worked as the assistant to the first governor of the prison since it opened. 10 years after the facility opened, Brebner became the governor. It was a position he held until his death in 1845. Brebner saw that humans were seldom at the forefront of the dank incarceration system in Scotland. Over his time as governor, he introduced radical reforms. He introduced regular and meaningful work programs for the inmates. Prisoners were housed in single cells and their conditions improved. His reforms also included a separate system for female prisoners who would only be cared for by female staff. In other prisons, men, women and children would still be packed into the same cells, something unthinkable today. Frederick Hill, the first inspector for prisons in Scotland, said in one of his first annual reports, open quotes, "Before the establishment in America of those prisons which have attracted so much attention, this unassuming but excellent man, Brebner, remarkable alike for the clearness of his intellect and his untiring benevolence, had organised and successfully conducted the system of which in many respects was theirs but a repetition." Close quotes. In other words, he's pioneering reforms in Scotland that have already been introduced in other parts of the world. Here at Duke Street Prison, Brebner introduced the basic classification of prisoners by sex and age. At the time, more than a third of prisoners in Scotland were women compared to 4% today. Brebner was also first to separate the juvenile prisoners from the adults and placed them in a different regime. Here they would learn trades and they would train them in good habits. Brebner would also reform conditions for staff, including pay and reduced hours. He brought in a teacher to hold evening classes. Many teachers even volunteered for this. Governors of prisons across Scotland were encouraged to send their staff to the Glasgow Bridewell for training, and by 1841, many were trained there. Brebner became a celebrity within the Scottish prison establishment and helped on several major projects. Despite his progressive work to create a positive culture in prison, Brebner is said to have had no doubt that if prisoner reformation was possible, it had to happen within the wider community, not within a prison. He raised a case for aftercare for prisoners when they depart the prison. His instrumental work helped establish houses of refuge for boys and girls in Glasgow. He was motivated to do this when seeing liberated youngsters fall into the arms of criminals and drawn back into a degenerate way of life. The attempts he made to establish similar aftercare houses for adults were unsuccessful, however. So much did he sympathise with the plight of the poor and unfortunate, he opened the prison to voluntary prisoners. I'll say that again, voluntary prisoners. It is understood he hosted 40 prisoners who willfully subjected themselves to the difficult life of imprisonment. This was brought to a swift end by the General Board of Directors of Prisons, saying that it was liable to affect public opinion regarding prisons as a place of punishment, that it interfered with discipline, and most crucially, increased the expense of the management. Typical. It's all about money. At the end of the day, it all comes down to money. Even in 1844. On January the 6th, 1845, William Brebner was summoned to a meeting of the General Board of Directors to discuss the provision of work for prisoners. He had just entered the offices in George Street when he collapsed, and he died instantly from a massive heart attack. His reputation was so highly regarded that the Glasgow Town Council voted to give him a public funeral. Frederick Hill noted in his autobiography that Brebner's coffin was, open quotes, followed to the grave by crowds of all classes, and the police in attendance recognised many who had formerly been in Mr. Brebner's charge as prisoners. Close quotes. The years would roll on, and for decades Duke Street Prison housed Glasgow's criminals. However, the city leaders decided to open a new, larger prison, the infamous HMP Barlinnie. In 1880, Barlinnie opened and much of the work in Duke Street was transferred over. Duke Street Prison remained a women-only prison. It was used for executions throughout its later tenure. Famously, it is known for housing many early women's rights and political activists. Their protests are considered to have widely contributed to the prison's closure in 1955. Scottish independence activist Wendy Wood, born 1892, died 1981, was imprisoned there for 60 days for refusing to pay national insurance. In 1913, suffragettes Doretha Chalmers Smith and Ethel Moorhead were jailed there for trying to set fire to a mansion at 6 Park Gardens in Glasgow, that's in the West End, near Cavengrove Park. Moorhead used her shoe to smash 3 cell windows and used it to knock the hat off the prison's governor. He had refused to move it despite being in the presence of a lady. The duo complained to the prison's commissioner about the conditions they endured. They said they were not being treated as political prisoners. Both were released on bail and did not show up for their trial. They would later be found and imprisoned for the original crime again. After being temporarily released due to illness, both decided to disappear. Smith was later reported to be at home, having become pregnant, but Moorhead was gone. She was found at Peebles in the Borders and was taken to prison in Edinburgh in the end. Other suffragettes imprisoned include Helen Crawford Anderson for breaking 2 windows of an army recruitment office at the Gallowgate in the East End. This was a protest against the arrest of famous suffragette Mrs. Pankhurst. Documented executions at the site include 12 between 1902 and 1928, and they were all murderers. The list also includes the last woman to be executed in Scotland, Susan Newell, in 1923. In 1839, the passing of an act to improve prison and prison discipline began the centralization process for prisons. From 1839 to 1862, 7 of Glasgow's other prisons were closed. Only Duke Street was left, and this is before Barlinnie opened. Further centralisation came into force between 1860 and 1877, and all prisons in Scotland were brought under state control rather than local government. This led to the building of larger complexes such as Barlinnie. As such, there was no need for Duke Street anymore, and come 1955, the prison was closed. It was demolished almost completely, in 1958. It made way for the Ladywell housing scheme that you can see today, which was built between 1961 and 64. You'll notice the tower blocks and the low-rise blocks there still standing, well maintained, well in use to this very day. The only remaining structure which I reference to is the boundary wall. This sandstone wall has been cut down to maybe a metre or so high at certain parts, and you can still see it all today, most of it at least. So it's the one part, if you go to visit that site, you will still see it, and you can just try and imagine the scale and what was once right there. I can guarantee most people, 99.99% of people, just drive past that housing estate and don't have a clue what was there. There was once this prison that was open for a long time, 155 or 156 years. It is hard to imagine that just a stone throw from George Square you had this prison. Well, there we go. That is the story condensed into a very short form of Duke Street Prison. It was the information that I've got on it. I could go on for maybe about half an hour or so, but a lot of it goes into we're talking about newspaper articles that I would love to have just read out, but they get a bit boring, and they're written in a kind of style that was, more popular back then. Not how we read things now, but it was a fascinating thing. I had no idea this place existed actually, and I was just kind of looking at interesting buildings and whatnot around Glasgow that I could potentially do another video on. Then I stumbled across Duke Street Prison, and I used to live on just off Duke Street a good few years ago, and passed this area quite often, and never had I ever known that there was at one point Glasgow's biggest prison complex right there. And we're not talking about a modern prison, a prison where you get your own lovely wee area, you get nice warm food, you get programs. Well, to be honest with you, as we just explained, that kind of did come in then, but it was unique in that sense. Typically speaking, a prison back then, it was a bloody awful place to be, and which it was when the Bridewell in Glasgow first opened, as we heard from the original article by the Glasgow Herald. Isn't it crazy that you can read an article from the Glasgow Herald from 1798 and you can go down the road and pick up a copy of it. Well, it's now called the Herald. All these years later, 230 years later, absolutely insane. When you think about it, history buffs, well, it's crazy to think that. And there's actually a huge well of information if you go back and look at old newspapers. It's something I keep meaning to do. I've got some old newspapers, but however, the main point in this video was about the Bridewell in Glasgow, and I do think when it first opened especially, it must have been an absolutely insane place to be. Overcrowding, as I said there, the size of a garden shed, you're having 8 people in there, men, women, children, and at the time, I read another article and it says there was 220 prisoners in it, and 160 of them were women as well, so what the hell? That's another video altogether. Why were there so many women in prison back then compared to men? I suppose they were getting put in prison for stupid things like hysteria and whatnot. it's nowadays it's 4% is the prison population of women. So that's a bit crazy. How that is worth some. I'm sure there'll be heaps and heaps of information on that. Just need to go and look it up. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I would love to hear what your thoughts are on other things that I could look into. Trying to find obscure things that aren't really documented. And I know it's very niche. Like Imperial era, Victorian era Glasgow history. I wouldn't say it's the most popular form of history, but I love it when I find a maybe 10 to 15 minute long video about some weird historical thing that is just so niche and so random, and that you listen to it, you think, wow, that's interesting, because you wouldn't stumble across that initially, and if you did, it would be in a book or something, and not everyone likes to read. Not everyone wants to sit and read a long article, but they'll happily stick on a video like this and go in the car. Anyway, if you share my passion for history, please follow the channel, like the video, subscribe even. I'm just about to rename it as well, so thank you so much.